Recording in progress.
Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Gimel. This is the Daf for Shabbat. Today's Daf is dedicated by Elizabeth Kirshner in loving memory of my father, by Gabriel M. Kirshner, Harav Gabriel Meir ben Harav Shraga Faiva, on his 25th year at site. I continue to grow. His absence feels even more prominent and painful at times. I imagine and grieve all the learning we could have explored together. I deeply hope that every word of Torah I learn on my Daf Yomi journey and beyond brings his soul and spirit great comfort. May his memory be a blessing for all of us. We're going to get started from I'll do a quick summary of what we saw in yesterday's daf, which was very important. First daf of Sukkah. We started with the basic machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis about a sukkah that's 20 cubits tall. Is it a good sukkah? According to the Rabbi Yehuda, yes. According to the rabbis, it is not a kosher sukkah. We sought three different approaches as to what the issue is. Either Rabbah, who said it's because you can't see, it's too high. And remember, the main part of the sukkah is the schach. Can't even see the schach. According to Rabbi Zera, it's because of the shade. You need shade from the schach, the top of the sukkah, and not shade from the walls. When it's so tall, the shade is coming from the walls, not from the schach. And then we saw Rabbah, who says this is a dirat keva. This is like a real house. Once you make it that big, it's a serious house. We need something much more temporary. Then we saw three different opinions about when exactly they debate, in which cases do they both agree on. So Rabbi Yoshaya said, if the walls get all the way up to the top, then everyone agrees that there's no machloket, because then you can see, and that coordinates with Rabbi's opinion, shalta ba'ene. You can, if your walls go all the way up to the top, then you can actually see. The problem is if the walls are short, meaning, the minimum height, but they're much shorter than 20 cubits, and then your schach is all the way up high, no one's going to pay attention to that because they're going to look at the airspace. But if the walls go all the way up, you'll see it. Rav Huna said that if it has 4 by 4 cubits, it's already that size, then it's not a problem according to everyone. And then it seems like the issue is the shade, because then you will get shade from the schach, even though the walls are very high, you're still going to get shade from the schach. It's when it's very narrow, it's less than 4 by 4, everyone will agree in that case. And then actually it's a debate then, according to them. Is it, will you get shade or will you not? But if it's less than that, then everyone agrees that the shade is you're definitely not getting any shade from the schach, you're getting it from the walls. At less than 4 by 4, everyone will agree it's a problem, even Rabbi Yehuda. And then we have, if it's I said that wrong. Sorry, need to correct myself. When you have 4 by 4, everyone agrees that the shade is going to be from the schach, and then you don't have an issue. It's when it's less than 4 by 4, that's when there's machloket. Do we have to worry about the shade coming from the schach or not? Rav Hanan says the machloket is if it doesn't hold, if it doesn't hold, right, minimum, bare minimum, yourself, your head, your head, most of your body, and your table. And then if it's machzeket, if it's already that big, right, which is much smaller than 4 by 4 amot, again, what's the change? That's 7. If it has your head, most of your body, and your table, it's 7 by 7 tfachim, handbreadths, and each 6 handbreadths to a cubit. So it's almost a quarter of the size less, a little bit more than a quarter of a size less than 4 by 4 amot, which is each, right, 24 cubits by 24 cubits. So he says at that amount, right, it's already going to be, everyone agrees it's going to be fine. It's less than that they have a machloket. Then we brought in this question on those opinions from the story of Heleni Amalka. So the story goes that the Braita says, I'll read it quickly, Rabbi Yehuda brought this case to prove his point. Maseh Heleni Amalka below. Below Amru la davar. She had a sukkah that was 20 amot, and the rabbis didn't tell her anything. And then they said to him, Misham Raya. It's clear from that case that they disagree about whatever case this was. Now, if you say, like Rav Hanan and Rav Huna, the machloket was when the sukkah was very small, either 7 by 7 handbreadths or 4 by 4 cubits, we're going to have a bit of a problem. And that's what we're going to read 3 lines from the bottom of Bet Amud Bet. If the walls don't get up to the schach, that's when they have a machloket. Does this work or not? Do we have to worry that nobody's going to see it? But if they go up all the way, nobody debates. Well, obviously, it makes sense then. It's very typical for a queen to sit in a sukkah with a lot of air, right? Sometimes you feel claustrophobic in a sukkah. The best is to have fresh air, right? The walls open. That makes a lot of sense. Therefore, they would have a machloket in this case, and that's what Rabbi Yehuda tries to bring this proof, and the rabbis saying, no, it's not proof. But but if you hold that the machloket is about a very small sukkah, but anything bigger than that, they don't disagree. Would a queen sit in such a teeny sukkah? No way would you have a queen sit in this teeny little sukkah. So, which means it doesn't really fit according to either of the other two interpretations. So, it means a sukkah is built with little rooms. Each one is like a little own separate sukkah. Okay? You can imagine a queen living in a house with lots of different rooms, compartments. What do I think of? It's a very funny connection, but what popped into my head was a pull-apart challah. You know those pull-apart challahs? It's made of a bunch of, you take like a roll of dough, you put a bunch of rolls of dough together, and they bake into one challah. This is actually a question, halachically, is it considered lechem mishnah, it in of itself, because each one is kind of a separate roll that's baked together. I never looked into the halachically what the story is, but I know it comes up. So likewise, we have all these different sukkahs. Each one is kind of separate. The way the pull-apart challah, you would say each one is a separate roll. They just happen to be together. Here you have these little different sukkahs. Each one is less than the requisite amount, and that's why they have a machloket about it. But then they say no. Even if you're a king, or a queen, you're not going to have a teeny little room all to yourself, and that's every little room is by itself. I mean, the king has a big banquet hall, and that's where everybody eats. It doesn't make any sense. So Amarav Ashilon Nisra Eli is going to modify it a little. Likitoniot Sheba. In other words, it's a gigantic sukkah she has. But there's little rooms that come off of the gigantic sukkahs. One sukkah plus a whole bunch of little other ones. Now, what's the debate of Yehuda and the rabbis about this sukkah? So the rabbis view it as, it must be. Now here it becomes the debate between them is a little bit about the reality of the case. The rabbis say, don't prove from this story. Why not? Because in this, what was the situation? The kids, the boys, they were sitting in the big room. They were yotzei their mitzvah of sukkah. The ihi, and she was sitting, she was sitting in the little room because of tzniut reasons, for privacy reasons. She was the woman, she sat by herself. Then she did it all halachically for her sons, but she didn't need to be halachic about it because she wasn't getting a mitzvah of sukkah. Yes, it's true, you could still get the mitzvah, but she wasn't obligated. So they certainly didn't need to say, you're not fulfilling the mitzvah, that you're not obligated to fulfill. And that's why and that's why they didn't say anything to her. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, I think the story went differently. Remember, the story didn't happen exactly, they didn't see it. They were told about the story. Rabbi Yehuda savar, they were sitting with her. They were sitting with her in one of the small rooms. And still the rabbis didn't say anything. And there's my proof that even with small rooms, 20 amot high, you still don't need, you can still be yotzei the mitzvah of sukkah. Next section. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak, halacha tzricha sheteh machzeket rosho v'rubo b'shulchano. The halacha is that you need rosho, rubo, shulchano. You need head, most everybody, and the table. It has to be a sukkah, she machzeket. Okay, it has to fit. Doesn't mean you have to have that on in the sukkah, but it has to fit. It has to be that size, which we said before is 7 by 7 handbreadths, very small. Amar Rabbi Ami, I recommend you measure 7 handbreadths, okay, like this, and measure it out and see how small it is, right? If I take 7 handbreadths here, right, I think I just counted 7, it's about this width. That's very, right? That by that is a really small amount. You can see me and my table, basically. That's what it is. So now, he says that's the halacha. Amalei Rabbi Abba, Kiman, Kibeit Shammai. What are you holding like Beit Shammai? Flip to page 28. Page 28, there's a machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel. It's a very famous machloket. Mi shehaya rosho v'rubo b'sukkah. One who had the majority of his body and his head and his table in the sukkah. I'm sorry, the majority of his body and his head in the sukkah. V'shulchano b'toch habayit. In other words, his whole head and the majority of his body. But his shulchan, his table, was in the house. Beit Shammai poslin, uBeit Hillel machshirin. Beit Hillel says this is fine. You don't need the table also. Your table could be in your house. Beit Shammai says, no, you need your table. So they say to him, right, are you paskening like Beit Shammai? We don't hold like Beit Shammai generally. And he said, to which he responds, Amarle Rabbi Abba Kiman to Beit Shammai. Rabbi Abba says, what, you're holding like Beit Shammai? Amarle, Ela Kiman, who else would I hold by? Yeah, I hold like Beit Shammai. You have a problem with it? No, that's who I hold. Igad Amr, some people read it differently. The Amar Rabbi Abba, the Amar Lechamani, who are you holding like? The Amar Le, he was just kind of asking, not questioning who you're holding like Beit Shammai. He just says, who do you hold by that you say this? Amar Le, Beit Shammai he v'lo tazuz meaning. This is Beit Shammai's opinion, and don't move from it. Meaning this you have to take seriously. And by the way, we hold this one. This is your shear for a minimum sukkah. Has to be now. What's the difference between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel? Beit Shammai will be 7 by 7. And Beit Hillel, who say you don't need a table, they say it's 1 tefach by 1 tefach less, 6 by 6 tefachim handbreadths, which is 1 amma by 1 amma, which is exactly a quarter of the 4 by 4. So now we're going to have a bit of a discussion about this. Matkifla Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, how are you connecting this with that? They're not the same thing. Mimai de Beit Shammai Beit Hillel, this sukkah ktana pleaded. Why are you assuming there when it says someone who sits, Rosho v'Rubo, your head and most of your body, and your shulchan is in the house? Beit Shammai says, good. Beit Hillel says it's good. Why do you assume they mean a sukkah that holds? It didn't say a sukkah that holds that amount. It says you were sitting in your sukkah, and your table was in the house. So mimai the besukkah ktana pligi dilma maybe besukkah gdola pligi ukigon diyatav apruba demitolta b'shulchano b'toch habayit. Maybe the issue is that you're in a big sukkah, like we have nowadays. Nobody sits in a teeny sukkah like that. And what happened was your table's in the house. You're sitting right on the edge of the sukkah. Your head and most of your body is in the sukkah, but your table's in the house. And then what's the machloket? The Beit Shammai Savle. Beit Shammai says, we're worried if your table's in there, you might end up eating in there. You might move toward the table and not be yotze the mitzvah of sukkah. Beit Hillel says, we're not worried. If you do that, you're right. You won't be, but we're not worried that maybe you'll do that. You know you have to sit in the sukkah, even if your table's inside, it's fine. So that's the machlok. And in which case, they're not arguing about the size of a sukkah. They're talking about within a big sukkah, what the whole issue is. Does your table have to be in the sukkah? Does your table not have to be in the sukkah? And now we're going to further prove from the wording of the Mishnah that seems like the simple reading. Then we're going to say, after that, from the wording of the Mishnah, it actually looks like the reverse. And then we're going to have to reconcile this. So first we'll prove why this seems to be the case. Daikadami dekatani, you can actually infer this from the wording. One who had his head and most of his body and is in the sukkah, and his table was in the house. Beit Shammai saying no good. Beit Hillel says it's a kosher. Right. Well, now I'm going to not focus on those words because those aren't the words I want to focus on right now. V'im ita, and if it was really the case that it's about the size of your sukkah, machzeket, the machzeket in the Bible, it should have said the same way Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak said, halachash tzricha shetei machzeket. It needs to be a sukkah that holds that amount, not one who is sitting in, right, who's sitting with most of his body, etc. So then the Gemara says, wait, ubesukkah ktana lo pligi? You think though they're not arguing about a small sukkah? Now they're going to prove the opposite. The Hatanya says in a Braita. First, they're not going to prove it from the words of the Mishnah. First, they're going to prove it from another. We're going to quote two Braitot and say there's contradiction between Braita A and Braita B. The resolution of this contradiction is going to prove that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagree about a sukkah ktana, about the size of a sukkah. So let's read. Machzeket rosho v'rubo b'shulchano kshera. If it holds your head and the majority of your body and your table, it's kasher. It's a good sukkah. Here it's clear. It's showing that size. Rebbe Omer ad shehebo arba mot al arba mot. Rebbe says that's no good. It needs to be a little less than 4 times the size. Instead of 7 by 7 handbreadths, it needs to be 4 by 4 cubits, which is 24 by 24 handbreadths. B'tanya idach, a different Braita says, Rebbe Omer, kol sukkah she'en ba'arba mot al arba mot psula. Any sukkah that doesn't have 4 by 4 is disqualified. That's the same, Rebbe. Here comes the contradiction. Chachamim omrim, which is parallel to the first opinion in the other Braita, afilu ena machzeket ela rosho v'rubo kshera. Notice what it says here. It needs to hold the majority of, it needs to hold your head and the majority of your body. It doesn't say anything about the shulchan. Ilu shulchano lo katane. Kashina hadade. So the rabbis in this Braita disagree with the Tanakama in the first Braita. First Braita said you need rosho, rubo, and shulchano. This one says just rosho, rubo. It must be. The rabbis who disagree with Rebbe in the first Braita is Beit Shammai. The rabbis who disagree with Rebbe in the second Braita is Beit Hillel. They're not the same rabbis. In which case, we see Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagree about the size of a sukkah because that's clearly the topic at hand. And not only that, but you can also infer from the Mishnah. As I told you, we're going to now infer the opposite from the Mishnah. It says Beit Shammai disqualify the sukkah, and Beit Hillel say it's a kosher sukkah, right? Kosher and pasul, right? Kosher, not kosher, invalid, has to do with the sukkah, not the person. The person, you would say, what would you say? In ita, if it's really about the person, and you're in this huge sukkah, but you decide to eat in the corner and your table's in the house. Beit Shammai lo yatsa, uBeit Hillel omrim yatsa. It should say Beit Shammai omrim, you don't fulfill your obligation. Beit Hillel says you do fulfill your obligation. It has to do with your obligation of sukkah and not if the sukkah kosher or not kosher. So it should say that mibadle. That's what it should have said. Ve'ela kasha. But wait, but again, back to the beginning. But the other part doesn't make sense. Misha haya sounds like it's talking about the person. You happen to have been sitting in that place. So how can we resolve this in general? Forget about whether we say it's sukkah gedolah, sukkah katana. The Mishnah itself seems to indicate both. How could that possibly be? So the Gemara says, Lo'olam b'tarte pligi. Really, their machloket is about both, in which case we can still say that Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak was holding like Beit Shammai, and that they do argue about a sukkah katana, but they also argue about a sukkah gedolah the way partly the Mishnah over there could be read. But in order to explain it that way, they're going to have to reinterpret the Mishnah. They're going to use the structure called the chisur mechaser b'hach katane, which means we assume that somehow words got lost in this Mishnah, and we're adding in words. Here we're going to read the Mishnah again. First, we're going to read the words in the Mishnah, right? So let me just read again. Pligi b'sukkah katana. They disagree about a sukkah katana, what the minimum size is, and pligi b'sukkah gdolah. They also disagree if one is sitting in the sukkah, a big sukkah where the sukkah is fine, but you're sitting in the corner and your table's inside the house. Are you allowed or not? So, how does it work? It's missing words and it should be read like this. Beit Shammai omrim, here come the words that are added. Beit Shammai say, lo yatsa, you're not fulfilling your obligation. Beit Hillel omrim yatsa. V'she'ena machzeket, we're still in the words that we're adding. And if it doesn't hold, ela kadei rosho v'rubo b'uvad, if it only holds your head and the majority of your body, Beit Shammai poslin, here we go back to the words of the Mishnah, Beit Shammai poslin uBeit Hillel machshirin. So the word poslin u'machshirin relates to a big sukkah. And the beginning, Misha Haya, relates to someone who was, relates to the person, and whether he or she fulfills their obligation when they're, or he really fulfills his obligation when he's in the sukkah and his table is in the house. Then there's one difficulty with this interpretation, which is then we have to really understand Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai is worried that maybe you'll end up going after your table. So if we say the sukkah is not big enough, it makes sense. Don't sit in a teeny sukkah because maybe you'll end up eating at your table, which is in the house. So we could say this sukkah is invalid because of the concern that we don't want people to end up accidentally in their house. If you're sitting in a perfectly good sukkah, and you're sitting in your sukkah, and the majority of your body's in the sukkah, and you're eating in the sukkah, and your table's in the house, Beit Shammai is going to tell you you don't fulfill your obligation, even though you actually ate in the sukkah. And even though, what's the issue? Well, the issue is that maybe you'll go in the house because of that concern that maybe you'll go in the house. Beit Shammai is going to say you can't fulfill an obligation. You actually ate in the sukkah. You're not fulfilling an obligation. So some of the commentaries explain, yeah, that's Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai is telling you, the rabbis come in and basically say, it's as if you're not fulfilling the mitzvah because you're doing something that could cause yourself or maybe others to make mistakes, and therefore we're not even going to let you fulfill your obligation. Obviously on a Doraita level, a Torah level, you're sitting in the sukkah. But the rabbis come in and institute, no, you're not. Next. Okay, so that's the way we understand that case, and now we're going to move on to something new. Connected, but different. Man Tana Lahad Tanu Rabbanan. Who is the Tana who holds? like the author, who's the Tan of this Braita, and we're going back to this Rebbe. Rebbe said 4 amot by 4 amot is Sukkah, and Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel say either 7 or 6 by 6 or 7 by 7 handbreds. So this Braita starts off. We're going to get into all sorts of other halachot. If your house isn't as big as 4 by 4 cubits, all of these laws are not going to apply. You don't have to put a mezuzah on your house. And the house is a place for living. This isn't a house meant for living. It's too small. You don't need to put a fence. What do you call it? To prevent someone from falling off the roof. It's not a house. Laws of a leprous house don't apply. If you sell your house in a walled city, you have a year to buy it back. If you don't buy it back within a year, you lose your option to ever buy that land back. It becomes the owner's fully. This is different from other laws about houses going back at Yovel, which are regular, that are unwalled cities. I'm not going to get into all those details. We will come across them more in detail in other places. But if you sell it and within a year you don't buy it back, it doesn't become permanently the other person's. You still have the rights to buy it back further on. Because it's not a house, and those laws apply to a house. When you go to war, they make an announcement. He gets up and he makes an announcement and he says, anyone who just built a house and hasn't yet lived in it for a year can go back home, but not if your house is less than 4 by 4 cubits. You don't have to be part of the Eruv. This is a review about laws of Eruv. If we all live in a common courtyard, we share a common courtyard, we can make an Eruv together, but we all have to be part of the Eruv. If someone decides not to be part, they mess it up for everyone else. If you live in this less than 4 by 4 house in this courtyard, you don't have to be part of the Eruv and you don't mess it up for anybody else. And you don't have to do shituk miva'ot, which means if we have 2 courtyards, a bunch of us live around one and a bunch of us live around the other, and we all share a common alleyway, and we want to carry within that alleyway from courtyard to courtyard, we can do what's called the shituk miva'ot, and we can put food down in the middle in one of the places, one of the courtyards, and we can share them all considered as if we all live together. You don't have to be part of this if you don't even live in a house there, because it's all about houses joining together. You're not even a house. If the Eruv gets put in one of the houses, we're going to see it's the Eruv Chatzera, not a Shituk. It says Eruv specifically. The Eruv gets put in one of the houses. We can't put it in this house because it's not considered a house. It has to be in a house. This is if we have 2 cities. You can't walk more than 2,000 cubits outside your city. But if there's a house in between both cities, less than 70 2/3 distance from, right? Less than 70 2/3 amot from each of the cities. This brings the cities together. There is if they're one city. So, last one. So this means if you have a house that's less than 4 by 4 amot, it's within 70 2/3 from each city, we don't say that these cities are joined as if they're one because it's not a house. And you don't split, you can't force one of your partners or your brothers that you inherited from to split this house between the 2 of you, although we're going to have to see what exactly that means. So first we're going to say, who is the author of this Braita? It must be Rebbe, and not the rabbis who disagree, because the house, just like Sukkah, is 4 by 4 cubits. The Gemara says, no, when it said it there, the rabbis, by Sukkah that you need, it could be even 6 by 6 tefachim or 7 by 7. They said it, Sukkah. When it comes to Sukkah, Sukkah isn't a house. This is the whole question. Is Sukkah your house? It just happens to be outside and just for a few days? Or is it something totally different? Sukkah has totally different rules according to this, because a Sukkah is not a house. A Sukkah is a temporary abode. For temporary abode, the needs are much less than for a permanent house. All these other things are a house, a permanent house. So therefore, you could say the rabbis agree. But when it comes to a house that's a real permanent house, people will only live in a permanent house if it's 4 by 4. For Sukkahs, you can manage. Go outside, a few days I can manage in something teeny. But on a regular basis, I would never live in a house like that. Below, if it doesn't have that size, they won't live in it. And therefore, you can't necessarily say that Braita is only red. Now we're going to go through details of that Braita, and that's where we'll finish today. Amar Patur min hamezuzah u'min ha'ma'akeh ve'em etameh b'nega'im ve'eno nechlap b'batei ha'ret choma ve'en chozrin alav me'orchei milchama. Okay, all those things we saw. The first few things on the list: no mezuzah, no ma'akeh. You don't need a barrier so nobody falls off the roof. No leprous house. It can't be permanently to the owner who buys it, even in a walled city, and you don't go back for war because of this. My timer. All of those say buy it. For a buy it, you need a real house. So now what about the eruv, the shituf, and you can't put the eruv there, my timer, right? So it's because all those things require living. The whole idea is that we're putting our living spaces together, and that's not a living space. Now they say, notice it says, it says you can't put the eruv there. But it sounds like you could put the shituf mevuot there. My timer, what's the reason? It's no worse than the courtyard of the mavoy. And the courtyard, right? We both have courtyards that open up into a common alleyway. We can put our shituf mevuot in the courtyard, okay? Because we're really doing a joining of courtyards. Since a courtyard is not a living space and this house is not a living space, it should be no different than a courtyard, and therefore you should be allowed to put the shituf mevuot there. How do you know that you can put a shituf mevuot in a courtyard? We're going to see right now. From first glance, it's going to sound like not, but they're going to correct it because they're going to say this obviously doesn't make sense. It says in the Mishnah, you put your eruv chatzerot in the courtyard, you put your shituf mevuot in the mavoy. That's against what we just said, but we're going to change this. They questioned and they said, how did this eruv chatzerot go in the courtyard? It says in the Mishnah, if you put your eruv in the guard's booth, or in a portico, or in a merpeset, a porch, which are not living spaces, ain't no eruv. It doesn't work as an eruv. So how could you possibly think to put it in a courtyard? No chance. The hadar sham ain't osel. And not only that, but in the beit shar, achsad, or merpeset, if you live there, you don't actually have to be part of the eruv. That's an aside. That's not important for our purposes. Therefore, Ela'ema, they say, based on that Mishnah, we reinterpret the previous one and say, Ela'ema eruv chatzerot b'bayit shebechatzerot. Must be the eruv chatzerot goes in a house in the courtyard, meaning you put it in one of the houses that's in that courtyard that you're trying to join the people who belong to that courtyard. And then here's the important part: shitufei mevuot b'chatzer shebemavoy. The shituf mevuot, since you're trying to join courtyards, it goes in one of the courtyards that you're trying to join, and then it means, right, everybody is as if they're a member of this courtyard, and then everyone there can go out into the mavoy from the courtyard. And if you can put it in the chatzer, in the courtyard, hailo gara mechatzer shebemavoy. Back to our issue. This house that's less than 4x4 is no worse than a courtyard because nobody lives in the courtyard. Likewise, nobody really would live in this house. It can't be this connector between the two cities. Now they point out it's not even like a borganin. What's a borganin? A borganin is normally what you end up seeing in between these two cities, which is a hut. Like the guards outside the cities were the fields. The guards would guard the fields. They would build a little house for themselves, a temporary place while they're guarding the fields. That, even if it's less than 4x4, it can join the cities. Why is that? Because it's built to be something small and temporary. But if you have a house there, a house can't work. That's what we're going to read right now. Even kiborganin lo mashvina my time. What's the reason? It's not even like a borganin. Meaning a borganin would be fine less than 4x4. But this is not, because borganin chazul lemiltayu. Halo chazul lemilte. Borganin is good for a borganin. In other words, that works for a shomer. You built this hut. It's a hut, and it works for a temporary abode, and therefore can connect these two cities for purposes of eruv tchumim. But right, this is to allow you to walk farther on Shabbat. But this, if you put a house in the middle of these two cities, nobody's going to live there, and it's not a guard's booth, so they're not using it for that. So it's a useless piece of, something that you built, and therefore, since it's not worthy for what you built it for, it's not considered anything. Now they're going to finish with this last one. The Ein Chokin, okay, the brothers. Ein Achim Shutafim Chokin. So it sounds like Tama de Lepe Arba al Arba. Right, Lepe Arba Amot. Ha Ipe Arba Amot Chokin. It sounds like if it was 4x4, you'd be able to split it. But that contradicts the Mishnah in Bava Batra. The Hatnan in Bava Batra, it says, Ein Chokin et HaChatzer ad sheheba Arba Amot lezeh va'arba amot lezeh. You can't split a courtyard, meaning I can't force you. If we inherited a courtyard, a lot of Baba Batra is about inheritance, not all, but part of it, and land. So we inherit a courtyard. I can force you to split it, okay? Why can I force you to split it? Well, I could only force you to split it. Right? If I want part of the courtyard, I can say, listen, it's mine also. I can force you to, if we're partners, if we're inheritors, I can force you to split it only if there's living space for both of us. It has to be more than, right? It has to have each of us needs to get 4 by 4. Otherwise, I can't force you to split it. So this sounds like all you need is 4 by 4, not 4 by 4 for each of us, right? It's half the size. Ela ema, so it can't mean what we thought it meant. Ela ema ein bodin chaluka kechatzer, doesn't have the laws of splitting like a courtyard. Let's explain what that is. A courtyard, we split based on how many exits to my house there are. Let's say we have each own a few houses in the courtyard. It doesn't go by how many houses we each own. The way we split the courtyard, it goes by how many doors I have outside my house. And what exactly does this mean? It doesn't mean, let's say you have one house and I have one house and you have one opening and I have two. It doesn't mean I get 2/3 of the courtyard, but let's hear what it means. We take the courtyard and we say like this. Everybody needs an exit from their house into the courtyard of 4 by 4 because we use that space. I go out of my house, I use the entranceway, I'll put down packages, I'll use it for all sorts of things right outside my door. That's my space. So if I have 2 exits and you have 1, I get 4 outside one exit, 4 cubits outside the other. You get only 4 outside your exit. Then, the rest of the courtyard, we split 50-50. But the space outside our doors, we each get our own. So now let's go back to what we said here. This is only for a house that needs the space outside the house because you're using the house. But this is not meant for a house. Nobody's living in there. So because of that, we're going to say, Lo yahabin lechatzer. So he doesn't get a chatzer. Right, this lemistar means it's going to be mistal. Someone's going to knock it down. It's not even a structure for use for any purpose because it's so small. Therefore, nobody gets, right, even if I own it, I don't get to claim 4 amot outside my house for the courtyard space. I don't get to claim that space. That's what it means. Ein achim v'shutafim. What's the words? Ein achim v'shutafim cholkim bo. They don't get their share of the courtyard from this house. That's it for today. We will pick up on Sunday with the continuation. Have a Shabbat Shalom or Shabbat.